The second issue of focus for me is what I categorize generally as rural and small practice issues, because I'm both of them. It's very selfish of me to focus on those, but I'm gonna anyway. For those of us in small towns and in small practices, we know that as the population ages and as lawyers generally age and approach the area of retirement, I would never say we're going to retire. I don't know any lawyer who really does. They say they do, and then they show up at the office and you can't get rid of them. They call them counsel. But as we get older and as we get more challenged to determine what's next, for small practitioners, I'll give you an example. Down in Antigonish County, I had a conversation with a very old friend of mine who describes literally having a barn full of files. Now, I assumed that was a bit of a hyperbole, a bit of an exaggeration, until he showed me a barn full of files. So what to do? What are we to tell him as the regulator about how he can go about an orderly transition to retirement? After all, we know there's no limitation period effectively on negligence, issue number one. Issue number two, what about the regulations around file retention and succession planning? Issue number two. Issue number three, I don't know much about this because I'm not a real estate lawyer, but I know you have to retain your foundation documents, whatever they are, ad infinitum, until you, your children, and your grandchildren expire. So what do we tell our practitioners about that? In a larger firm, you will know that that is largely taken care of institutionally. But in a small firm, in a solo practice, it just isn't. So we have to try to provide guidance and assistance to lawyers. Now, I'll tell you this, we don't decide most of this. For example, limitation period issues, that's a government responsibility. But you need to know your counsel is working actively with the government to pursue changes to the Limitation of Actions Act. The government's presented them and will continue to press them to make them so that there's some sort of a finite date at which you can rely on that your limitation or liability will end. Now, we're not there. We don't know how long it'll take to get there. Anybody who's dealt with government can understand the analogy of a glacier. But we will continue to work on that. We're going to work on the notion of what kind of guidance we can give you about all of these issues. And finally, we're doing work around the notion of, to be blunt, how do we renew in the rural areas the practice of law? Many of us are, I go to court, but for my QC, I would still be sitting in a chambers date in Pictou for a good 2 hours because despite the fact I'm practicing 20 years, I'm still middle of the road in terms of seniority at that counsel desk, which tells all of us we're getting older. And so in rural areas, the renewal is a tough subject. How do we attract lawyers? I think we should make a note about the air miles suggestion that Glenn had earlier, but short of that, we have a challenge. But you need to know that your council, your society, and I are working on that in the coming year and the coming years to try to find some solutions, but they're not easy. We would welcome any suggestions you have, and the working group on rural practice, headed by Carol Gillies of Antigonish, is actively engaged in that discussion now.